You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum.
The 1988 film Die Hard, starring Bruce Willis as Detective John McClane, is not only an action classic, but some would argue it is a Christmas classic. Off-duty NYPD Detective McClane arrives in Los Angeles, hoping to reconcile with his estranged wife during her company's Christmas party at Nakatomi Plaza. But then he finds himself pitted against ruthless terrorist Hans Gruber, who's taken the entire party hostage. Detective McClane goes beyond the call of duty to take down terrorists at Nakatomi Plaza. He climbs through air vents, engages in shootouts, and attempts to negotiate for the safety of the hostages, all while struggling to get in touch with local authorities. Inspired by the National Law Enforcement Museum's Reel-to-Reel exhibit, we decided to sit down with an actual law enforcement professional to talk about just how realistic the policing strategies utilized by Detective McClane are in Die Hard. Anna Muckenfoos, the museum's manager of programs and education initiatives and host of Precinct 444's Law and Disorder, and Chris Mitchell, the producer of Precinct 444, sat down with museum law enforcement volunteer Wayne Steinhilber, a recently retired lieutenant with the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, who was also a bit of a film buff. They discussed Die Hard just in time for the holiday season.
Is this a Christmas movie? Or is it a contemporary action classic?
That is a very good question. I think it turns into, and one of the reasons why we chose this for kind of Christmas time for this bonus episode, it's a very timely release. I believe it kind of, at least from my impressions of Die Hard as a civilian and just somebody who likes to watch movies, I think that it's become kind of a cult classic Christmas movie, as they kind of call it. But
Exactly.
It definitely was not intended to be put out as a Christmas movie. It just kind of is circumstantial that it takes place around Christmas time. So, and you have people, I believe they're attending a Christmas party.
They are. That's exactly
Yeah,
for the...
and so it's like because of that little connection, now it's a Christmas movie. But I think it's Die Hard is something that it exists in our pop culture beyond just the fact that it's an action movie. It's an action movie. It's a law enforcement related movie. It's considered a Christmas movie just because of the timing that it takes place. And then it's kind of gained this cult following as a Christmas movie. So it's kind of like you always have these weird little traditions around different holidays that you may not necessarily think, oh, that's kind of out of the box. And the one around Christmas is really Die Hard. And that's kind of a fun thing.
I think you can definitely make the argument that it is a Christmas movie. It's not, it's a Christmas themed movie,
Yes.
but in a traditional sense, it's not a Christmas movie.
No,
because
it's not National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation.
No, it's not.
They're not celebrating a family Christmas. They're not
No.
doing something you would typically think of during Christmas.
Right. And I think that's the distinction between Die Hard and any other Christmas
Yeah.
movie is that they're not celebrating Christmas throughout the entirety
Yes.
of the film.
Yes, but it is a motif. It's a theme within the movie.
Because you can watch any movie during Christmas and say it's your Christmas tradition
I have
or
a lot of
holiday
things
tradition.
that came back. And
You really can. And another really good part about this movie is, and just movies that involve law enforcement in general, is being able to kind of watch them and kind of think, how realistic actually is this? Would you actually climb through the vents during an investigation, like what John McClane is going through in Die Hard? Like, would you actually get up in the vents? Would you be kind of performing your own first aid, things of that nature? And we'll kind of get into that as we get into the episode.
well, this is a treat for me because my wife is a big fan of British crime dramas.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, and now I have to sit, watch, and of course I would be the commentator. Oh, they don't do that here. Oh, I'd get in trouble doing that. Oh, that's bad tactics, or the uniform's wrong. So, completely shut down on that. And I said, well, here, and then she said, well, there you go. You've got that all pent up of commentary on the tactics and the uniforms, and would they do that in American law enforcement, let alone what they'd be doing, what the British police do have at it. So it's a real
Excellent.
treat to do that.
Oh, yeah. And so before we really get started talking about the film, let's talk about your law enforcement experience. So today we have one of our law enforcement volunteers, Wayne Steinhilber, is here with us. He is going to kind of give us our law enforcement perspective on as we talk about this film. So Wayne, just give us a little background tell us about your law enforcement career before we get started.
Well, I was born and raised in Glendale, California. Attended public schools. So when this is taking place in Los Angeles, I harken back to did a college internship, attended USC, got my degree in public affairs, and did a internship with the Los Angeles Police Department. So it was interesting to see a lot of the here and just overall some very, very good technical advising. If you see towards the end in the credits where they credit a police advisor, and that looks at things like uniforms and the equipment on there, and it's really first rate of how that's done. So it's a whole different perspective of looking at this movie. You've certainly seen it and seen it occasionally, but now coming in and looking at it now really, really focused, and it gave me a very good appreciation for the technical work that they did there, because it's actually very, very accurate.
That's awesome.
In a lot of those components.
That's awesome. And you spent a good amount of your actual law enforcement career with the Metropolitan Police Department.
My entire career,
DC,
yeah.
Right?
That was a second career. I was the second oldest in my academy at 40 years. 40 years of old, and that was when they were coming in, the millennial cops in year 2000. And had a very, very good career, starting out in midnight patrol, then going to the foot beat, where it was on a Segway when they started the Segway program. So I'm the first DC officer to be on a Segway.
That's awesome.
And going through and being a bike officer, promoted as a sergeant. The 5th District got pulled to Patrol Services Bureau as one of the administrative sergeants that were there, and then later on as a promotion to lieutenant. And that's assignments is Special Operations Division. I was head of the Uniform Equipment and Supply Bureau, did the issuance of the body-worn cameras, and then, of course, doing that uniform conversion where we went from those light powder blue shirts that you were probably familiar to now to the external, which was quite a big major change in uniform deployment for officers, and then finished up as a watch commander for day work here in this district, which you're in right now, 1st District.
That's awesome. And we're really happy to have you here
Glad
on the
to be here
podcast with us. I think this is going to be a great episode. So let's start off by diving into the film. So it takes place in Los Angeles. Similar to DC, it's a big city with lots of buildings that have security details in it. When you're watching this movie, you can't help but notice that the security detail seems a little bit light, especially in some of those initial scenes. I know this film took place in, I believe it was in the 1980s. So
right, 1988 was
so pre 9/11, which changed the way that 9/11 obviously changed the way that we secure our buildings. It changed the way that we secure our airports, everything. How realistic is the building security, do you think, in the film Die Hard?
That actual scene is actually fairly accurate of how you'd have your staffing. Now, if you understand the setting for this, we're after normal business hours. It's an Ataki corporation that's having their annual Christmas party. It's upstairs, so it would not be unusual to see just the one guard there, and then you have the other guard that was supposed to have been control access there at the elevator. You cite not the changes in 9/11. There certainly was an upstaffing. I have an advantage here. My wife's a commercial property manager, so that was one of the, when we were looking at this, was asking, said, how did that change? Oh my goodness, yes, that we had upstaff, and that's actually a factor when they're trying to lease space. Well, what is your security? What do you do? And we've seen probably the most change recently right here locally in 2020, where you have the civil disturbances that were going on downtown. Very, very intense. These were during night hours. And it highlighted the importance of that guard behind that desk. As you think it's a midnight shift, maybe that's the only person there is a janitor. So we had instances where the crowds have come in, they broke right through, and were able to come right into the lobbies of these buildings. Fortunately, where we have the downtown business improvement district, and I represent the police department, and a lot of these property managers, security teams were getting together and talking about best practices of going through how to be handling this. And that was probably your most of the appreciation of these property managers, as well as the police, knowing that it benefited us to make sure that these people that were there are your most important. They're their most important person, because they're initially going to set the whole frame for the success of that building, making sure they're not leaving keys exposed, leaving control access to the elevators and so forth. So I thought that was fairly
That's
fairly
great.
accurate.
I love when we can go through some of those scenes, and because, you know, as a civilian, you think that looks really light on security, or how would that actually happen? So hearing that it actually is fairly accurately depicted.
And they did have the automated, if you
interesting.
saw them, they have the audit sign in where you came in, where they had to have the names for this, and you had the map of the building and coming through. So you had some of that, the foreshadowing, more of the high tech
Exactly.
that's coming into play in our buildings now.
Yeah.
They had a pretty robust security system up front too, with
Right,
cameras and
right,
everything
with the
too,
cameras and
especially for
everything were there.
1988 seems
Right.
very high tech.
And it was. And what you've seen got turned to their disadvantage, because
Right.
immediately showing the planning and organization of our terrorist element, that was something, well, that was beneficial. They got control of that very, very easily, and then were able to see play by play of everything from what was going on internally, controlling communications, and all that is fairly possible. If you had a group that was that organized, that focus, and it was that technical savvy, could be pulling that off, and how important that is to be having controls, making sure that those property managers, those security personnel, and certainly those building engineers, and especially the security engineers in your security contractors and your engineers, people that are running that building, there's no light between them, and they're kind of the unsung heroes that really help keep the building safe, especially when it's after hours, something like this.
And then fire alarm is pulled. No, the fire alarm is pulled. That really kind of starts our chain of events, right? You know, when the fire alarm is pulled, like at a school or something like that, fire department obviously comes in. They're checking to see what is going on, assessing the situation, trying to get everybody out of the building so that no one gets hurt. What happens in for law enforcement officers once a fire alarm is pulled? Like, I know it mostly probably goes to fire department. They're obviously notified to show up at the site, but you usually get police cars too. So what does that kind of look like as a first responder getting that notification?
Well, in Washington, D.C., we have what's known Unified Communications Center. Now, it used to be, if you were to go, it's under renovation now, police headquarters there at 300 Indiana Avenue. If you go to the top floor, they're demoing where the old communications center was. And you can see the old photos of these officers nearing retirement, dispatching. I've got the Rolodex and putting this stuff through. If you go to McMillan Reservoir, there's the old police or the old fire department headquarters, and that's where they did their dispatching. They actually have the old-fashioned antenna. Of course, it's long rusting, but now it's all centralized. And you see when they call in, when he gets on that radio, that they're able to know about the previous call. I know I'm jumping ahead, but the unified communications and how that's pulled. It shows that I liked it because it shows and kind of sets the tone for his whole performance, is showing this as a brave, resourceful, innovative officer, and he sees that sprinkler and goes ahead and triggers that. That response, actually, to be technical, would come across as an alarm call. No confirmed fire. That would be a minimum response from the fire department. You would not have that cancellation. You would not be able, even if they called from the building now, don't cancel. It'd be a fire out. You'd still have units that would be responding to that. The police would not receive those calls just for a simple alarm call. We may come across that. We may have officers that come across it, and then we'll call that in. And of course, the first thing that they want to know, do you smell smoke in the area? Do you have fire or anything? And we'll have a minimum response to go in. And then sometimes they've come in and found fire or something, and then it's what's known as fill the box, all the additional apparatus responding on that. But I thought that was a smart move for them.
Mm-hmm. A good way to kind of get that communication started before having the access to the radio, which we kind of mentioned next. So he makes that request over the radio. It's not taken very seriously. Only a single patrol unit shows up. if someone calls for service, if an officer who's somewhere calls for service or calls for backup, what does that usually look like? Is that a very realistic type of the one patrol unit coming
for
out?
the purpose of the movie, I'm going to fault him here. I'd be very technical on that. I think it's where he goes, Mayday, Mayday. And right away, I'm thinking of some sort of, like you would say, of this nautical term on this. He never identifies himself. And of course, I'm being very, very technical. And this is why I'm not on a beach in California, large house writing screenplays. Very technical. He only says Mayday, Mayday 2 times. It's supposed to be 3 times if you're going to be using that, the international distress signal. Doesn't identify himself as an officer. Probably if he had, and said something to the case to Los Angeles Police Dispatch, I'm an off-duty New York City police officer. I am at this location. There is a terrorist event taking place. We have gunfire. We have people taking hostages. Would have certainly treated that a whole lot differently. But then it wouldn't set the whole scene up where, of course, they cue the music about the snow falling, and then the terrorist hits the front of Sergeant Powell's car, and then everything breaks loose, and we finally bring all this flood of assistance to the location on that. But for that was I fault our good friend, our Officer McLean, on that point. Yes,
he definitely could have improved his radio etiquette a little bit there. We do see, and it's very shortly after McLean calls for assistance over that radio, or calls over the radio ineffectively, I should say. There are flashes of light on the top of the building, and they're spotted by a patrol officer on the street. If a patrol officer sees something going on, but there hasn't been like a 911 call about a crime, what kind of role does that officer have to investigate what's going on? Or what kind of obligation do they have?
Well, he's certainly, then they're a very attentive officer to be looking up at that and looking that up. And as I recall that, he gets a call. He's at the reinforcing the stereotypes that cops eat donuts, or in this case, tweakies.
Well, of course.
All right, I'm going to snap into business here, and looks out. Hey, it's right up the street. Let me take a look. And how convenient. It looks right down the boulevard in there, and he sees before he goes. And they end up begrudgingly, the dispatcher supervisor sends, and what would come out is check the welfare. Well, would send 2 officers at a minimum to go and check that. But he's finally dispatched to go check that. And that the first 2 officers responsible for, if he's seen something, investigate, calling that in. And who has it and it's called scene assessment. When he finally gets dispatched and he goes out in front there, and Bruce Willis says, who's driving that car? Stevie Wonder. You can't say that now. But he goes in how he's making that whole summary, That's the most important person right now. And that's a scene, what we call the scene size up, or the scene survey. Now, who does that best is the fire department. Mm-hmm. And this would be, and they have, and you'll see that across the nation, it's just in small departments, not a very structured of how they report something. So you have for house fire, say, okay, and the broadcast, it goes something like this: engine 11 on scene, 2-story brick, single family home, fire showing, 2nd story, report of 1 trapped in a rear bedroom, to the rear, side C, exposures, A and C side. We have a hydrant out front, and we have 1 civilian injury with burns. I'm giving you a whole lot of information, but you'll see that in some of these broadcasts, and that's always something we push our officers, because now it's automated, a lot of the dispatching on scene is simply that button. But to be looking ahead and looking at a whole scene and following a structure of sizing all of this up. And now, so the fire department is able to do very succinct. That first engine that's coming on scene sets the whole tone for the approach.
Mm-hmm. And from the way that you describe it, it sounds like the same thing kind of happens with law enforcement.
Absolutely. So, and you see that he does the right thing later as he starts to, as the scenes now develop. And this is after the terrorist has fallen. We realize this is serious. And you see Sergeant Powell then taking command. He's getting information. And then what's our hero doing? He's outlining how many people are there, and he's describing part of their nationalities and a whole lot of information of how to be approaching how to be handling that situation. Excellent. But the concern about something that came up when it was how that was being reported, you can see that in the headlines now with the tactic that's known as swatting, is where people will call in and will outline just as horrific situations, people holding hostages. I think there's gunfire. I hear people screaming, and knowing that is going to send a massive amount of police, fire, and EMS to a particular location, and they're found out. And we're seeing more and more of that, a lot of it being targeted some of our elected officials and in the judiciary.
And we do see SWAT show up later on in this film as well, which we can kind of skip ahead and talk about that a little bit. We do see they're having negotiations with the terrorists. There's a lot of, when SWAT moves in, it's very important to make sure it's very planned out, because you could have a lot of risk to hostages. Calling in SWAT is a very critical moment in kind of the de-escalation of a situation, such as that is happening in our film here. So have you ever had to call SWAT as part of an investigation, or been in part of an investigation that had to do that?
Well, it's just by chance. That's the first SWAT was in LAP, was formed by LAPD in Los Angeles in 1966. It's rarely, that term's rarely used now. They've trying to demilitarize. So it's Special Response Team. Here in DC, it's ERT, Emergency Response Team. Just an interesting of how the names for that. We've seen that develop rapidly. I think if you go down to the display for the law enforcement and the TV culture, you see the original SWAT. And it was this thing that could be, an Amazon delivery truck, but it's menacingly painted black, and that was it. That was,
it looks
just
like
would come up.
Military armored vehicle, kind of.
Yeah. No windows. It must have been hotter than hell inside, and they would pull out, and they'd come out, and they're all in them those tailored black uniforms and the AR-15s, and that was about the extent of their gear. And if you now have how they have expanded the capacities, the equipment that they have to have, you see now a big part of this is the negotiators. Actually, who starts a negotiation, we have to give credit to his wife, who starts in the discussion about, taking care of the pregnant female, and then arranging for bathroom breaks, and he's starting that initial dialogue and getting that opening in. So she goes and starts that. But the importance of role that front loading a lot of this is you'll have all that firepower, you'll have all that equipment, but a big part of the teams are the negotiators, and their sole job is to be opening that dialogue. That was kind of, freelancing, where you had the assistant chief, and we'll get to that. Just shows up on the scene and starts getting involved with that. You'd have a trained negotiator in there, one-on-one communication. This was unusual, and of course you had the radio where everyone's like an old-fashioned party line. Everyone's listening to it. The bad guy's listening with the good guy, vice versa, and all this talk and everything. Not very practical, but it's for the benefit of the movie. But the capacity of the ERT teams, MPD has an excellent team. People that are combat medics. Being able to breach into situations, and they've developed. We'll go around and look at what's going on in the nation. What are other agencies encountering if it's problems with, and like where you saw some of where these active shooter situations where they're going in and locking exits so people can't flee. Well, making sure that you're checking for that, and you have the equipment that's front loaded to have that all in. So that was important. And we've seen how that was put in, but that was the genesis of with LAPD, and seeing that all put in there.
Absolutely. And it's something that the general public that doesn't know a lot about law enforcement history may not realize that nuance of we're watching the SWAT team from the LAPD come and kind of take over, join the investigation, or join the, I should say, de-escalation of the situation that's going on.
They tried for voluntary compliance. That would be the ideal situation. Would have been that they would have picked up one of those phones, talked to them, and said, "Look, you're surrounded, and there. Please rethink this. You don't need that $460 million in bearer bonds."
Yes.
And officer, you're right, or Ms. Jones, sometimes it's civilian, just for ratchets it down. You'd be talking to a civilian, and so you're right. Okay, we're going to come out and we're going to surrender, and that's excellent. So you think that would be the first
That's how you
outcome.
want
It's
it to
usually
be.
not going to go there again, or we wouldn't have a
Yes.
movie, and we have to have all the drama and everything. But you certainly, that would be the goal, would be the voluntary compliance, and you work from there, and making sure you have good men and women that are disciplined, that are going to do what you say, and hopefully get to a good outcome.
Absolutely. And we also want to talk about no one was monitoring those radio lines right before SWAT moves in. To a civilian, that feels like a really big red flag. Like, radio is kind of one of our big, at least what we understand, radios are incredibly important for officers communicating with one another on patrol, especially communicating with McClane, the lone man inside. Why wasn't somebody monitoring that radio line? And it's probably for the drama of the film. But is that something that, is it realistic to believe that someone wouldn't be paying attention to the radio, especially during a high-stakes situation like the one here on Die Hard?
The communications now are encrypted, but if you can see, and we've seen the increase of that, you can still, there are workarounds to that where they can pick up through channels, so it's not as what you used to do before. I remember in California, you could turn on and by, and you could sit there and shift and listen to the dispatch and go to the tactical channel, and you could be listening in until they suddenly realize, well, if Wayne Steinhilber's, in his bedroom listening to this, and probably the bad guys are too.
Yeah.
And then start this whole thing of the idea of encryption. But even with that, are able to get, and you see some of these freelance journalists you see on Twitter that are just, they're one-man production units and just a car, and are be able to monitor and go into these things and to be able to put that stuff out. That, of course, would be monitored if you'd heard something that was going on. You would have been doing that. The not very practical that you'd have this open line, this open walkie-talkie system where you're, they're learning names, and then when Sergeant Powell, the episode where he says, "Well, why are you behind a desk?" "Oh, well, I made a mistake. I had an accident." "Well, what'd you do?" "I've seen you drive. I can understand that." No, and gets into this whole very personal about a bad shooting. Mm-hmm. And everything comes in. Well, you certainly wouldn't be doing that, because you wouldn't be personalizing yourself. It kind of undercuts the whole, especially when you have them listening to everything that you're doing. That was highly, would have gotten your ERT commander, whoever was on there, that once that team was brought in, would have put a stop to that. But again, you wouldn't have had the great movie if you weren't listening, because you learned something personal.
The plot wouldn't have advanced as quickly or as effectively had we not had that heart-to-heart kind of conversation on the radio there.
And that's how he's keeping in track with the other, who's down? Oh, okay. Oh my God, he's got the detonators. He finally realizes, George, he had the detonators. Now we're in trouble.
So we do see there's a lot of humor in Die Hard. There's a lot of John McClane has his very dry humor to deal with kind of the situations that he's in. I know at one point he's climbing through the vents and saying he knows what says he knows what a TV dinner feels like, being in that vent. So the job of law enforcement, whether you're climbing through vents and trying to take down terrorists, or just patrolling your beat in a squad car, there are difficult parts. There are a lot of difficult moments in law enforcement careers. And
it helps diffuse.
And it helps diffuse the situation. Exactly. So John McClane's using his humor to kind of cope with the difficult situation at hand. What kind of experience do you have seeing law enforcement officers kind of diffuse or balance that stress of their career using humor?
Well, full disclosure, I liked his line prior to that, where he goes, he's in the air shaft, and he hits the lighter, and he says, "Come out to the coast." He said, "We'll get together. We'll have a few laughs." And then you have all this chaos that's going around him, and that's how he deals. But why he jokes, he certainly is being very. And look at the situation that he's in, and some of the stuff. There are books written about it, the police humor. And I think of Joseph Wumbaugh, of some of the Choir Boys, and some of his movies where you saw some of the police humor. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm showing a bias because I'm from California, and seeing that, and that's important. And that's in their friends group. Mm-hmm. Now, there was something different. I think I had an advantage, because if you maybe have somebody that's only 20 years or something that's initially coming on, and they go into law enforcement, they're going to lose, especially today, are going to lose a certain amount of friends. Well, you're doing what? You're not going to be an investment banker. Oh, you're going to be a police officer. Okay. And you're just going to have that natural separation of, so, because it's a special calling. I had the advantage in that I had a civilian career. This was a second career for me. So I could call, I certainly had people that were civilians, stuff that I talked to. And then you had your law enforcement. But that's critical that you're talking through these things. And sometimes people have maybe heard something in some of the jokes. I said, you got to be careful in these scenes when you're doing that stuff. Yes, and the terms like either you're sanitizing the event, you're compartmentalizing the event, all different terms for how you're dealing with that. And I think if you're getting through, if that humor enables you to get through and to put those things in perspective, and especially not be bringing that home, because if you're holding that in or something and then you're seeing that come home, and we've seen particularly with all the civil disturbances in 2020 and then what happened at in January at the Capitol, was that intense, prolonged events that were there. And for my platoon, and we were on bikes during that time, and that was 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and we were lucky to get that seventh day, and sometimes you'd even have to come in maybe half day or something, and you kind of saw then that was something that they were counseling us and talking about, that you need to be watching for stress in your people, see how they're reacting, and it can take that. So was there a humor element? Of course, and being able to laugh and be able to have that kind of camaraderie.
Yes.
And be able to vent and have those things. But again, you got to remember where you are. You got to, you're not making sure that you're,
making sure you're still
people aren't listening to that, and you're still,
making sure you're still staying serious, but then kind of lightening the kind of stress load that can happen in that.
But he
moment.
comes off again very from how he starts and how he's looking when he arrives on the plane. Of course, then he's got the gun. Don't worry, I've got. Of course, you can know how things have changed. Here he's got a gun on a plane, and that used to be where you'd go up to. I'm old enough to remember where you could walk up to a counter and actually, put down a credit card. I'd like to go to San Diego. Certainly, sir. And here it is. And they take cash, and you'd get right on the plane, and then he's able to smoke and in the airport and everything else. So that he's our hero, very working class, blue collar hero, and then he's thrust into this, a very successful corporate world. And of all things was the Nataki Corporation. If you remember, if you know your economics, that was all when the late 80s is when a lot of that, when the devaluation, when you had the devaluation and there was the buying spree, and you had a lot of the Japanese were buying a lot of corporations. And so it's very timely how the politics and the background of how they frame.
It absolutely is. It's not, it was definitely inspired by something that, even though it's a little bit more, dramatic because it's Hollywood, but it's something that watching that movie, especially watching the movie at the time that it came out, it would feel like, oh, this is something that could happen right now, or reflective of America.
But of all company, you have that company that's in there that bought the company out and doing the renovations, because you see they're buying more, expanding the space, and doing that in. And I thought another one was the classical piece that they chose. And if you pay attention, that's Beethoven's Ode to Joy. And you see that continuously, that soundtrack being played through there. And I thought that was so interesting because during that time, politically, you had a lot of stuff going on in Europe. Now, the wall isn't coming down. Yeah. But again, it's another social of the background of that. And I just think that someone whoever did that music there in tongue-in-cheek, because that's the national anthem of the European Union. It was all the background of what all the ideals of the European Union. And then, of course, you have this terrorist group that's trying to release all these terror groups that are held in different European countries.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And then, let's see. And finally, we have John McClane is speaking with the chief of police as they're about to defuse the situation, or more so, the building is about to explode. But we want to talk about the way that McClane is kind of talking with that deputy chief of police. McClane is not part of that department. Right. But it's a good example of an officer speaking with a superior officer, or even an officer from a different agency kind of communicating with someone in a major agency with a very high role. What does the typical officer to superior relationship look like? And how would that conversation probably have gone.
Well, you wouldn't have it couldn't have gone that
reality.
way. That's like drunk texting or writing your drunk email. It sounds very cogent and very everything, and exactly how everyone's feeling to be talking to a command. And then, of course, well, that wasn't the smartest thing to do. I like how they just framed this. And there's actually how we see this deputy chief. How does he arrive? He has his driver, and they drive right through the mud, and they come there and they splash people, and he jumps right out, and he's not even in uniform. He's in this, nice tailored suit, and he flashes his badge and immediately takes command. And fortunately and goes in, of course, and then he's not listening to the sergeant experience. And we're lucky from that in the point that nationwide we have what's known as the incident command system, which we do certifications on, and you train in this. And if you're going to be a sergeant and you're going to be a lieutenant, and then, of course, something more important is you come through. And the idea in that the person on scene that's best qualified to address that situation safely does not necessarily have to be the highest rank. You can certainly be the highest rank and then give operational control to somebody else. But the whole thing of how they present him, and that's kind of just in keeping with the Dirty Harry series. There's always that corporate style police leader they're never in uniform. If you see some of these, they're always there, and they're always in immediate contact with the mayor's office, and then they're always this direct communication with that. So it's always that little sub-foe in the event you have the terrorists up there. And I always notice,
not necessarily in Die Hard, but I notice in just films about policing in general, films, TV shows, what have you, most of the detectives are never in uniform. They're always in plain clothes of some kind.
Which they would be, right. And but then as a chief, and we saw that was, that he's wearing and wearing that, not immediately identified. And of course, and that's how, and you see the mistakes that he does. And that's one of the reasons, thanks God, we have a system. Now, whether everybody follows it is another thing, because you've got now people in there, and they've got, these uniforms on when they are wearing them, and they've got the scrambled eggs, and you've got a whole lot of police ego on a scene, and it's usually to the detriment of one person, either that sergeant or the sergeant, that lieutenant, or maybe that captain that's the watch commander trying to manage that scene, because then again, every one of them shows up on scene, expects a briefing, and then starts having to do something. They don't just stay back, and it's usually get involved in this stuff. And that is a real issue, and it's constantly brought up about let us run the scenes and how that's supposed to be, how those are supposed to be run.
Yeah. And then the final moment that I really want to talk about is John McClane's escape. So the building is exploding. He ties a fire hose around his waist and jumps off the top of the building. That seems like it is not realistic at all, especially because building is exploding. It's going to fall. He's just expedited his fall from this tall building. If you are in an exploding building, what would an officer actually do?
Let me make a projection that you as well will not be writing screenplays and being on it.
I will
with
not
that,
be
with
writing
the practical
screenplays.
side. With that, of course, something of going in and breaking against that window and using. They've done that, and they've had escapes where people have gone and actually done that. And some of them, if they're maintained properly, usually if you still have something like those, they're usually rusted, and they're from the Depression era in an older building and everything. But yeah, there are people that have gone and gone down and seen where they pulled stuff out and repelled there. Yeah, I mean, he was very generous. He was able to get the glass to break at exactly the right time.
And the exact right
and to slide
angle.
in just as it's done, and then it almost starts to drag him out, and he's able to self-extract with that. But our hero survives too.
Yes,
for another
he survives and appears to be not very injured. He is injured.
I think he's more with you felt with him with the break the glass, and he's got his feet, and he's
got his feet. He already has his feet are all cut from the shootout and kind of walking across the floor barefoot. Like he's just kind of a mess by the time he's.
And that's the theme throughout. So that he's kind of framed in advance as a good guy with a gun, but he's also barefoot.
Yes.
And he's able to do all these very good things, and does that. He's resourceful enough. He tries to get into the shoes of the first terrorist that he neutralizes, and finds out his shoes are too small, and his daughter and everything, and he just takes him right off and keeps right on marching. So that's our Officer McClane.
That is our Officer McClane. So thank you so much, Wayne, for coming in and talking about Die Hard with us.
Absolutely. And
we're very excited to be bringing the museum's, kind of expanding the museum's existing reel-to-reel exhibit, and by having some more conversations about films that feature law enforcement officers and the field of law enforcement, because the way that we see law enforcement in pop culture, in movies, film, TV, really shapes the way that we see, that civilians especially kind of see law enforcement.
Absolutely. And I've enjoyed it. And Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and Yippee-ki-yay.
Yes, exactly.
Can't say the other part of that.
No, we won't do that.
Part of that, but Yippee-ki-yay,
Yep,
Die Hard.
yippee-ki-yay, yep.
Very good. So thank you so much for coming and spending some time with us today.
Take care. Be safe.
We hope you enjoyed this special reel-to-reel edition of Precinct 444. From all of us here at the Precinct, we wish you a happy and healthy holiday season and hope that you have a great start to 2023.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.